have talked about this in my book in terms of actually an invented term called colonizing discourse. So what I'm trying to do with that term is imagine or describe how empires try to manage the relationship with colonized people. How do they try and manage relationships with less powerful people? How do they seek to maintain power and control? And I talk about this in my book, so I think I will not go through it all now. Just to say that I really think that colonizers have tried to dominate others materially, physically, symbolically. They've tried to separate groups. Apartheid is a really good example of that, where this idea of keeping different people apart from each other. But at the same time, and ironically, as they've tried to keep people separate from each other, they've also tried to make everyone the same. So they try and put everyone together under one flag or one identity that actually tries to suppress difference and squash variety. The last category is what I've called fixedness, and it's actually really interesting. I think I'll talk about that a little bit more. Colonialism, empire, imperialism, whatever word you want to use, has really tried to present a stable and unified worldview, assuming that there is one way to see reality. So colonizers have always tried to convince the colonized that the language of empire is normative, it is the standard, and everything else is deviant. And that creates hierarchies in societies between ruler and ruled, colonizer, colonized, civil and savage. And in that construction, there's only room for one story. There's one version of reality, and there's one valid social construction of relationships. It means everything has been decided, and there's no room for change within that system. Our lives, as I said, are played out on the stage of empire. And while colonizing discourse, it's a made-up term, it's not familiar to most people, I think it is a familiar discourse. It's a reality that we live out all the time, whether we realize it or not, because we're accustomed to a world where some people dominate, in which some people are kept apart from others for various reasons, in which we value homogeneity over diversity, and in which there is a preference for one single worldview. That is not always true. I think that is less true as time goes by. But for many of us, whether we mean to or not, those categories come easily to us. Those tendencies come easily to us, to expect that there are people who are more powerful than others, that there are more people who are perhaps more valuable than others. And even though we have those tendencies, our lived reality challenges that. Because what happened, and one of the best fruits, I would say, of the colonial
There she goes. Okay. Hello again.
Can she hear us? Can you hear us?
Can you hear us, Dr. Travis? Not yet.
I think she's getting.
process.
There we go. Okay, we can hear you now.
Is that better?
Yep.
Yes.
We're back.
Hey.
All right. Thanks for hanging in there.
Okay?
Yeah, I think it sounds fine. Yeah.
Okay. So I was just saying that colonialism, especially European colonialism, had this effect on North America where it brought everybody together to the same place. And how miraculous is that? In North America, we live in this sort of in-between space where there really isn't east or west or north or south. It's not simple anymore to define the demographic of our local communities. It's not simple to define the demographics of many of our churches. The culture becomes very blurry and messy. And suddenly those neatly defined boundaries of colonizing discourse just don't work anymore. My argument in the book is that obviously that I perceive colonizing discourse to be a bad thing, even though you can argue that there have been benefits to the colonial process. I think that the language and the actions and the beliefs that we use to dominate and separate and try and make everyone the same and fix categories, I think those are bad things. Those are ways that I personally have judged modernity in its treatment of human communities. So I think we need to respond to that negative aspect of all this theologically. And I've really been influenced by Moltmann and this idea of the social trinity, and that you can read chapter 4 in my book, I think. But the basic idea is that Creator and Son and Holy Spirit live in a particular kind of community that's characterized by the exact opposite of colonizing discourse. So they live in a community characterized by equality and mutuality, diversity, and openness. So we who are created are drawn into that and have the option of responding to one another, not with the language of colonizing discourse, but with the language of Trinity. A couple of comments about leadership. I maybe should have said this at the beginning of the conversation, but it's always a question whether a white, wealthy, educated, privileged Canadian woman has any right to say anything at all about postcolonial theory. But postcolonial theorists acknowledge and affirm that colonialism has negatively affected everyone involved. So not only the colonized person, but colonizer as well needs to be decolonized. I also know that I need to be careful because I benefit from the system that I am critiquing. I think preaching is a potentially transformative practice, but it is also a dangerous practice. It's dangerous because our words are powerful and they have the potential to shape identity and practice. Our words are heard by real people with real histories who live in real contexts. And it's easy for us to unintentionally ignore or erase or divide or harm people. I've really thought about this in terms of how we preach gospel, how we talk about good news. We really want to say something as preachers that is true about God and about the world. But postcolonial theology reminds us that truth is complicated. We can only ever say something partially, and more than one thing can be true in relation to a situation or a text. I think we've learned this through some of the modern, the recent truth and reconciliation processes, like in South Africa or in Canada here, that multiple truths, multiple experiences can be named at the same time and coexist uncomfortably with one another. So honoring difference is essential in postcolonial preaching. As we construct sermons, we can be aware that there is space for more than one truth to be spoken. It's a hard question. What is good news for the colonizer? What is good news for the colonized? And what is good news for those of us who exist somewhere in between? And what does it mean when we're talking to all of those people at the same time? We really need to know who we are as preachers. We need to know where we are located and have some idea. About the very Am I back?
Yes, you are.
I gotta tell you, postcolonial theory is complicated, but it is not as complicated as technology.
Amen.
So I was saying that we need to be aware of our own locations. And what that means as preachers is that we need to be aware, for example, of the way Scripture has been used as both a weapon of colonialism and a redemptive force for the colonized. We also preach within institutional churches that have been involved and may continue to be involved in colonizing discourse. As I mentioned before, in terms of, you maybe didn't hear this part, it was right at the beginning, but talking about Canada's history with its Aboriginal people. And really trying to come to terms with that in terms of what it means for the church. The Presbyterian Church in Canada, to which I belong, has a history of participation in colonial projects. It fully participated in taking children away from their parents so that they could be deprived of their Aboriginal values and heritage. So now, as part of its reconciliation, it encourages congregations before worship service, at the beginning of a worship service, and at the beginning of meetings, to actually acknowledge that the land we're worshiping on has been occupied for 15,000 years, and that it once belonged to someone else, and that there is dispute and tension in that relationship. So think about when you're preaching about the land you're standing on, and what does that mean for what you say and how you will be heard. I need to remember as a preacher that I am one voice, and I need to make sure that I'm leaving space for the voices of others. And that's really, really difficult. It's hard because I've really been changed. Since I need to write the next book, I think, because I have a lot more to say. As I've come to recognize really the complexity of this situation. There's a Monty Python video. I'm not a Monty Python fan, but this video is cute because they're sitting around, the British are sitting around saying, what did the Romans ever do for us? You know, they're trying to come, it's a joke about that sort of colonial reality. And of course, they start thinking about what is it that these colonizers ever did for them. And someone says, well, aqueducts. And someone else says, education. And someone else says, medicine. And roads. And you realize that there is a flip side to the colonial process. That it's impossible to characterize it as fully positive or fully negative. But you know that there's people in your congregation who will have particular views on that, positively or negatively. So what happens? What happens when we preach to all of these people? And we'll think about that. You can think about that more fully in terms of your own context. I watch the news. I know what's going on in the US and the challenges this summer in terms of issues of race and power and violence. But we're preaching to all of those people. what are the wounds and the scars that people are carrying around with them as they listen? What are they assuming? What happens between the people who sit in those pews? What is the experience of listeners when they go to work or go to the shopping mall? Some of them are comfortable in their own context. Some of them are threatened and powerless. Some will feel relieved and pleased when the subject of colonial discourse is raised. Others will feel guilty. So I suspect that as preachers, in some ways, what we're doing is acting as moderators of a large and complicated discussion about national history, personal histories, and the history of God's action in the world. We will not figure this out, but can we make space somehow for healing and the building of stronger communities? That is the hope, and I think that's our call as preachers and leaders in this very complicated world. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right. Now, we did get started a little late, and Dr. Travis, I'm wondering if we could hold you over for another 15 minutes. Would that be possible?
Sure.
For questions?
Sure.
And let me ask our camera person, Nora, is that okay if we go through? You sure?
Yeah.
Okay. So we're going to have 15 minutes for questions, and I know Danielle may also want to chime in the chat room. Please feel free, Danielle, to do that. Does anyone have a question you'd like to ask Dr. Travis to get us started? Yes.
In the chapter you mentioned, in kind of like maybe very broad terms, how the church and the field of theology were very late to the game in this conversation. And perhaps that's because the church has often maybe benefited from these dynamics or has found itself in a tug of war in varied post-colonial contexts. But I would love for you to speak a little bit more to why you think theology is late to the game in this conversation.
Why did we come late to the game?
Yes.
That's a good question. I have a sense, and I don't know if Dr. Jacobson agrees with me or not, but I mean, homiletics seems to come to these discussions about 20 years after other fields.
Dang straight.
It's a good question, because I was actually talking to someone who was reading my book as part of a book study. And I'm not actually sure that she was reading it from a Christian point of view. She was just part of this group, and they were, for whatever reason, they were reading my book. But she was telling me, she has a PhD in education, and she was talking about how the things I was writing about, she had been thinking about 20 years ago in the field of education. So it's a great question. Why did it take so long? I have a feeling that it really does have to do with who has generated conversation within theological circles for a long time. You know, when you think of the great theologians of the 20th century, they were mostly white, European, North American men. So I'm not saying that they should have started this conversation, because they could not have started this conversation. This conversation arose out of the margins. The problem is the margins don't get heard quickly. Now the question, though, of why the church chose to ignore the margins is a very good one. And I think it really has to do with the way the church has been structured in modern times. It's very different now, but it was always about churches in Europe or North America sending mission outward. What's happened now is that the trend is reversed. And what was the center is now starting to listen to what was the margins. Whether that means that the voices on the margins had been silenced or ignored, or maybe just hadn't been given opportunity to speak. But I don't know, that doesn't really answer the question of why the church took longer than secular institutions to start talking about this. I'd have to think about that more.
Thank you.
Yes.
Dr. Curtis, you mentioned in the chapter that there are some critiques on postcolonial theories because they are born from white privileged Western scholarship. If it's appropriate or to ask, could you share your own experience about if you experienced any challenges, limitations, or maybe advantage as a white Canadian scholar who's studying postcolonial or decolonizing preaching? If you hear me.
We would sleep.
I just want to hear the end of that again. So, have I experienced advantages?
Perhaps challenges, limitations, or advantages as a scholar, a white Canadian scholar who is studying postcolonial preaching.
Yeah, I really want to start answering that with a self-critique, because if I have one main critique of my book, is that it does not have nearly enough conversation with others. In fact, my book, you could argue, is a case in point for what happens in colonizing discourse, because I still struggle with whether I should have tackled these issues in my own context without having more conversation with those who actually live in the margins. I have not experienced in any really negative way colonialism. I do think, the fact that I was able to get this book published easily and without a huge amount of effort tells me that my white educated privilege probably mattered. I have not had to fight ever to get my voice heard. Does that answer anything at all?
It does actually, yeah. I was thinking, like, would it be better if you could employ some the actual voices or experience from the people who were colonized in your book? That was my thought when I was reading your chapter.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any plan for that for your future publication?
Yeah. Well, and yeah, I think that's the next frontier for privileged people who are writing about postcolonial theory. I really found it challenging, actually, and continue to, speaking of examples, wanting to include examples of sermons, for example, that talk about, that employ the theories of postcoloniality. They're very, very difficult to find, maybe because they're not being preached here. If you preach a postcolonial sermon at Riverside Church in New York City, it's on YouTube. If you preach a postcolonial sermon in Managua, it's less likely to be heard and available. So I'm wondering how those conversations can happen more fully, especially in homiletics. Because even within the academy, there's a certain amount of diversity, but if you're a member of an academic academy in North America, it already means that you are privileged, that you are educated, and that you have access to such a thing. So how do we enter into those conversations? I'm not sure, but I want to find out.
Thank you.
Please.
I'm particularly intrigued with understanding how we got to where we were at this point. and what led up to this, and now that we're aware of, and there's a lot of discourse about post-colonial period. Some of the language talks about the colonizer wanting to control, wanting to name and mandate how their reality is. And in thinking about day-to-day life, it's difficult to see like the intentionality of building a world like that, like individuals deciding I'm gonna wake up today and build a colonial structure that will oppress people. And I know it doesn't happen overnight, but in just thinking about how we got there, I was wondering if you have any examples that demonstrate, and I recognize that you're working on the backside and not on the front side, but if there are examples of how we got to these systems that we then need to name and work to deconstruct and dismantle.
How do we get to that system, or how does it function daily?
I think I'm thinking about the human individuals that build these systems. Like how does that work to actually produce these systems that are oppressive? And then I don't know if I'm articulating this well at all. Does that make any sense?
I feel like you've just asked a huge question.
Yeah.
How these systems, I mean, really, if you look at modern colonialism, and probably pre-modern colonialism, there's very good reasons behind it in terms of, a lot of it's economic. There was Europe needed stuff. They needed places to grow it and produce it, and so they shipped people to those places to produce stuff to send back to Europe. So that's just one example of how that happened. Maybe it sounds too socialist, but I mean, I think you, as a Canadian, I can say that. Economics matters. Production has been such a part of our human history. As to why it happens, I think it has to do with how human beings use power. Really, this whole conversation is about power. It's about, one of the most interesting things for me about colonial history is the way that it repeats itself in strange ways. And so, often, at the end, when a colonizer withdraws, and a people become independent, they will sometimes revert to the same systems that were used against them. The most straightforward one, and I think I talk about this in the book, is what I just talked about, that Monty Python sketch. So Britain was a colonized place. It was colonized by Rome. And yet, when Rome was no more, Britain actually functioned in exactly the same way. So these are patterns that seem to be perpetrated for many reasons. It has to do with human nature, it has to do with economics, it has to do with theology, and how we have constructed God, and how God functions on one side or another in our understanding.
Any other questions? I'm sorry? Please, Melanie.
I was wondering if you could comment on the Christianity that's happening in colonized countries in these days, whether there
Right.
is still, sorry.
I'm not huge.
I was wondering if you could comment on the Christianity in colonized countries, countries that were colonized before, whether there is a brand of Christianity that still has colonialism in its flavor. For example, in the kind of worship that we do, in the kind of theology that we have, in basically just the style of Christianity that we have, whether there is still a form of colonialism that is there that is not decolonized yet.
Yeah, I think so. If I'm understanding your question correctly, I absolutely think so. And I mean, it's interesting to me. I think this is true. I'm not entirely sure, but I'm pretty sure that in seminaries around the world, people are taught preaching using the work of sort of 19th century Americans, 19th, 20th century Americans. So that's an example of how I'm not sure that there has been enough time or enough support for indigenous local theologies to be enacted or privileged or wanted. I'll tell you an example from when I've been in India, and I'm in worship there, which basically mostly looks like 19th century Protestant Canadian worship, except the clothing is different. And the prayers, there was one time I was listening to a prayer, and it was in Hindi. So the preacher was speaking very quickly in Hindi, and then all of a sudden he said, "Sunday school superintendent." And I thought, what? And I realized that there are some words that are left over, some concepts, terms, roles that are left over from the missionaries that never got translated into the native language, into the local language. And that probably is because those ideas and concepts did not actually work within that local context. To have a Sunday school superintendent is a very, that relates to a particular time in North American church history, and yet it is preserved there uncomfortably. So I absolutely think, again, I don't know, I can only think about what I've seen and what I have read and guessed. I have not lived it.
Thank you very much, Melanie. Thank you, Dr. Travis. Really appreciate you giving not only your time, but a little extra time today. And I thank you for your perseverance for our technological glitches as well. So thank you for helping us out today, and let me invite the class to join together in offering and wish you all the best.
Thank you, and I'll be really happy to hear critiques as you read through my book, because there's a lot that needs to be thought about more.
You know, yeah, we're checking out now, but we're going to actually talk more about it for another 15 minutes among ourselves too. So
okay,
we'll try to keep that. Yeah, of course, but we'll try to keep the dialogue going as well.
Okay, great.
Thank you, Dr.
Thank you
Travis.
so much.
All right, bye-bye.